Marion is Vice President of the Darwin Club, been with us right from the beginning. I came across Marion and her work some time ago with her excellent book on Darwinian social cultural evolution, which has been a path-breaking book in the area. And she's one of the few sociologists who are serious about this kind of area and Darwinian evolution, and who understand what it means. We constantly complain about other sociologists' misunderstandings here, but I won't go on any further. Marion, thank you very much for presenting this time. Your talk will be on joint ecological and social models of the coevolution of somatic and reproductive functions. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Can you hear me all right? So my topic today, thank you all for coming, is joint ecological and social models of the coevolution of somatic and reproductive functions, biological, sociocultural, and gene culture coevolution. That's quite a lump, but I'll probably try and simplify it for you. There are three premises that I'll be using that I am assuming in the models that I will put up in the table eventually. Now, the three premises are, the first one is that evolutionary ecology using optimization methods and social evolution using game theory methods are both needed together. Usually they're done separately. So somebody does something about evolution in interaction with the ecological environment and use optimization, or evolution in interaction with ecological with other members of the same population, social evolution, and game theory. But populations don't evolve separately with respect to one or with respect to the other. They evolve with respect to both together. So my first premise is that we need both evolutionary ecology and social evolution together. Now, my second premise is that for convenience, I will use density dependence relative to resources for the ecological. I'll assume that somatic, again, for convenience, I'll assume that somatic and reproductive functions use the same resources and that the environment is patchy. We can start either with many small or few large, but things, originals, if you like. Either you're talking about the origin of life or of any new level or major transition, cells, multicellular organisms, eusocial colonies, whatever. We're starting with what was there originally. So with many small and low density relative to resources, that means plentiful resources. The strategy here is, in the literature, it's been variously called spend, quantity, or frequency. What you do is you consume, eat and excrete, and produce many small offspring. Consumption and production. But if you start with a few large things and you have scarce resources, then you digest, it's very simply called investing quality or cost. You digest, break down and build up, and reproduce a few large offspring. Now, what is this digesting and reproducing all about? What's it for? Well, if you're in a situation where resources are scarce, then you need to get out of there. And how can you do that? Well, that's the 3 M's. If the environment's patchy, you can disperse in space, like maintenance, perhaps enter into diapause, to take an extreme example, or motility, move somewhere else, or mutability, change niches, whether that's literal, like increase your mutation rate, and some species do that under stress, or you can perhaps adaptive phenotypic plasticity. If you already have more than one way of responding to these different circumstances, you can just switch phenotypically. The way, say, insects switch between getting their nectar from different species of flowers, as different species become open on their seasonal times. Okay, so low densities, many small, consume and produce. High densities, digest and reproduce, make a few large offspring. And these digestion and reproduction are in order to disperse in time, space, or niche to get to where resources are plentiful again, hopefully. Now, it's only hopefully, you're never guaranteed of success, of course. Now, there's a basic physical reason for these associations. Small things have a disproportionate surface area relative to volume. Large things have a disproportionate volume relative to surface area. And having a disproportionate surface area is good for consuming and producing many small offspring. A disproportionate volume is good for digesting, for breaking down and building up these mechanisms of the 3Ms. So the stereotypes of these two different kinds of situations are, at the low density one, you have a small body size, early age at maturity, many small offspring in a batch at short interbirth intervals, and a short lifespan. At high density, you have a large body size, a late age at maturity, a few large offspring in a batch at long interbirth intervals, and a long lifespan. That sounds kind of complicated, but just think mice versus men, say. Now, these are stereotypes. These are positive correlations in nature, but they're not perfectly correlated by any manner of means. For example, resources may be plentiful in a wide area of space, but only for a short time. So body size and lifespan are not necessarily perfectly correlated. Or resources might be scarce, but available for a longer period of time. So again, the body size and the lifespan may not be perfectly correlated, and so on. And of course, there are other things that matter too. Density relative to antagonists, like parasites and predators, matter. But generally, those will be the reverse of those with respect to resources, so I won't talk about them. And there are other things that matter. For example, history matters. Remember, Darwin's theory is descent with modification, not just the modification part. So, your ancestry of the taxonomic group you belong to and its ancestry matters too. Okay, so the first premise is that we need both the ecological and social together. The second premise is that I'll be using density dependence relative to resources, low versus high, consume and produce versus digest and reproduce. The third premise is about social evolution. So social evolution can be cooperative, competitive, or conflictual, and in two different ways. What is unusual here is I'm talking about social evolution between somatic and reproductive functions. And I'm not totally confident of this, but maybe for the rest of the summer, I'll write this up and submit it to a good journal and see what a few good referees have to say about it. But that's what's quite unusual about this. All right, so there are the models that I've been explaining the assumptions I'm making. So the rows are the social strategies, cooperative, competitive, parasitic, and predatory. The columns to the right of those, the first column, the outer columns, the first outer column is biological. So you consume and produce on the left and digest and reproduce on the right. The second outer column is the cultural. So at low densities, you learn individually, let's say by trial and error, for example, and you teach using individual learning methods. Perhaps you emit the cues, warnings, rewards, and punishments, for example, that will structure others' behavior. But at high density, you think about what you've learned and put it into long-term memory, maybe even into words, and you teach socially. You may model, or you may actually transmit the words so that the person that you or people that you transmit it to can then transmit it to others, reproduce. And the third column is gene culture coevolution. And the first row there is genes and culture match. The pattern is the same there, but the reason is a little bit different, as I'll explain. So let's go back to the first column again, the biological column, the cooperative. So you both somatic and reproductive match. So somatically is in the first row and reproductive is in the second. So you consume, the more you consume, the more you can produce, and the more you produce, the more you can consume. And that's because your many small offspring have a lot of surface area too. Whereas the more you digest, the more you're able to reproduce, and the more you reproduce, the more you're able to digest. Now, the second row, competitive row, both somatic and reproductive are favored to unmatch instead of matching. So if consuming and producing are engaging in competition with each other, then it pays one or the other or both to switch to their other strategy and so on. So everybody is favored to switch, no matter who does it first. They're favored to unmatch. The last two are a little bit more complicated. The third one is reproductive functions are parasitic on somatic functions. So following the arrows, you start at the top left, top right, bottom right, and if you're successful, back to the top left again. Now what those are is the top left you consume, and reproductive functions parasitize your somatic functions and take resources from their soma to produce many small offspring. If it's being parasitized, then that favors your soma to switch strategy, and it switches to digestion. Now, this is a little bit complicated because the reason for the switch can be to evade, to defend, or to counterattack. So we'll take the two extremes. If you're switching to evade being parasitized, then, well, it favors the reproductive to just parasitize that to reproduce. If you're switching to counterattack, then it also favors the reproductive to reproduce, but to do so with its own resources. So in the first case, the somatic functions are all ecological and the reproductive functions are all parasitic. In the second case, both somatic and reproductive functions are partially ecological and partially social. But in both cases, if the reproduction is successful, that is, these grand offspring manage to get to a time, place, or niche where resources are plentiful again, then you're back up to the left, up to consumption again. Now, the last one is just basically more or less the opposite of that. The somatic is predatory on the reproductive. So you start at the bottom right, reproduce, go up to the top right, down to the bottom left, up to the top left, up to consumption. And if you're successful, you go down to reproduction again. Now, basically, the psychological and sociocultural are basically the same. That is, you can match, unmatch, or you can have parasitic or predatory relationships. I won't go into these in detail, but let's say just take the third one, learning individually and teaching individually. How many profs do you know that have spent so much time and energy on their teaching that they didn't have time to learn anything enough themselves and get any research done? But the last column, the gene culture, is a little bit different. This is from my article on gene culture coevolution, which did not deal particularly with density dependence some years ago. But the basic reason here is different, that the strategies here depend upon the way culture is transmitted relative to the genetic. So if culture is transmitted in the top box, the first row, if culture is transmitted vertically, it tends to favor genes and culture to match. If it's transmitted obliquely, like if my biological children become your cultural descendants and your cultural descendants become your biological descendants become my cultural descendants, then they're favored to unmatch. And you can have parasitic and predatory. And my article on social forces about those has lots of examples about things that were known at the time about that. Now I'm going to go away from the table for a minute. And that's just that's just what I was just explaining. And I don't want you to pay attention to the top half of that, but I do want you to pay attention to the bottom half of that page. The question is, how do these models contribute to a new or inclusive evolutionary synthesis, which is what we're all after right now? Well, density dependence relative to resources gets ecology in, and the antagonists are the reverse. Having somatic and reproductive functions both as co-evolving actors gets development in, because it has a somatic function as an actor as well. And the models combine ecological and social evolution for both. Now, one thing this does is it solves, or one of the big things it does, I think, is it solves the problem of replication. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I'm going to explain a little bit of it to you. A long time ago, there was a very brilliant guy by the name of Wallace Arthur in 2006 who made an argument that organisms don't have life cycles, but that they are life cycles. Now, keep that in mind for a moment. Think about a cell doubling in size and dividing once. The genes may have replicated perfectly. They may have identical genes, but the idea that those two cells or multicellular organisms or eusocial colonies or anything else that supposedly, the idea that those are replicating is ridiculous. Think about what two cells have in them. They've got all those things that used to be prokaryotic cells, hundreds, even thousands of mitochondria, which now function as power plants for the cell. There's also plastids, which in lots of plants anyway. There are ribosomes, which are essentially assembly lines. There are lots of membranes, which are buildings like the endoplasmic reticulum and stuff. There are lots of enzymes, which are tools, and a whole host of other resources. So the idea that because you replicate the genome and then this huge cell doubles in size and divides, that the cells are replicas is ridiculous. It's just not the case. We know it isn't the case. So when we talk about different formulations of evolutionary theory, and this group has discussed several of these different formulations at different times, like excuse me, the population geneticists, the relative frequencies of alternative alleles, either stays constant or changes depending upon depending upon mutation, migration, drift, or selection, or David Hull's replication, variation, interaction, and selection, or Donald Campbell's selective retention, and so on. At least some of these include replication, but we know cells don't replicate. So can we only say something about genes and not say anything about cells or organisms? Well, if replication is of life cycles, if organisms are life cycles, and Arthur had the R and so on in italics, if they are life cycles and you have a model of the conditions under which life cycles are replicated, then you can talk about not organisms, but you can talk about life cycles as being replicated. So consider a simple semmelparous life cycle, an organism which grows and reproduces all at the end of the life cycle. When has that life cycle been reproduced? Well, it's been reproduced when the offspring have grown and produced offspring, i.e., when the grand offspring have been born. In other words, you have to repeat the somatic and the reproductive functions in order to repeat a life cycle. And if you go back up for a minute to that table, and you'll remember there, in each case, that's true. It's possible, at least, although not necessarily the case, that you've repeated both somatic and reproductive functions, whether we're talking about the cooperative or the competitive, or either of the antagonistic cases. So that's what I think, if this is right, what it contributes to. Now, there is a big contradiction with respect to values, and this is kind of interesting. If you look down the left side, we have density dependence of what we've been talking about, low density relative to resources versus high density, and consume and produce versus digest and reproduce. And we think of the low densities as good conditions, right? Having lots of resources is good. And having scarce resources, well, that's not so good. That's bad conditions. But think about the human demographic transition. Before the human demographic transition, which was high fertility and high mortality, we think of that as bad conditions. And after the demographic transition, after all this progress to industrial societies with low fertility and low mortality, we think of those as good conditions. And if we take a look at conventional sex roles, males, if they produce potential offspring at high frequency but low per capita cost, sperm, that's neither good nor bad. And if females produce potential offspring at low frequency but high per capita cost, eggs, that's neither good nor bad. So the first row, we have good, bad. The second row, we have bad, good. And the third row, we have neither one. So what's the answer to this? Well, first of all, what's the puzzle exactly? What's the contradiction? The contradiction is that that left column is all high fertility and high mortality. And the right column is all low fertility and low mortality. That is, empirically, they are the same thing, even though we think of them as very different. So how do we reconcile that the left column and the right column are different, yet in the first two, we value them differently? Well, in the first two, I'd say the alternatives are not good or bad. They're just adapted to different conditions, like the third one is. Let's say maybe high densities, relative resources is not so bad. It's just a different set of conditions under which you have to do something different. You're favored to move or to maintain or to mutate. It's just different set of conditions with different strategies required, that's all. And with the human demographic transition, well, maybe it wasn't so bad back there. They had more contact with nature. And when you come up to here, up to modern industrial societies, maybe it's not so great. You often have to be prepared to wait. You often have to move. Look at the migrations that are going on around the world these days. And you often have to innovate. So maybe it's not so great. Now, there's a lesson here to be learned from two famous essays by the 19th century sociologist Max Weber, one called Science as a Vocation, and the other one called Politics as a Vocation. Science, the thesis of both of them was that science cannot answer questions of value, although it can be brought to bear on them. So, for example, if you have a goal in mind, at its best, science might be able to tell you how to achieve it. If you have a means in mind, science at its best might be able to tell you what its consequences are likely to be. Or if you have two goals in mind, science might be able to tell you whether they're compatible. But in and of itself, it cannot answer questions of value. And that's all I have to say off the top. So I'm happy to take any comments or questions, except now I don't know what to do with my computer.
Thanks very much, Marion. Any comments or questions, as Marion requested?
Should I minimize?
Yes,
Should I minimize my screen, Brian?
No,
you could just.
no, you okay as you are. Jan Willem.
Yes, as I'm turning my camera on. Thank you for that, Marion. I'm still trying to get my head around some of what you've been saying, and I'm not sure that I followed everything, especially in the first part with your very detailed table. There's some stuff there that maybe you can clarify later, but the last part, I thought there were some very interesting things. I've got two, but I'll stick to one, and then if there's time later, I will get to the second one. You towards the end talked about what is specific about humans, and especially also with different gender roles in the whole mating process. And you discussed that in terms of what on earlier slides were good and bad environments. And then you said, yeah, maybe some of them are neither good nor bad. My thought there as you were developing this was that could it be that one reason for the discussion you were having there and the fact that these good or bad labels were maybe not so accurate anymore is that the type of scarce resource is very different and has changed a lot, in the following sense that if you think of traditional evolution among other plants or other animals, it's very much about scarce natural resources, energy, and maybe scarce mating opportunities. But in modern humans, also if you think in terms of your second strategy was the, if I remember, the build and migrate, or I'm using the wrong labels here, but the second one was about building and migrating.
This is fairly standard human demography, the human demographic transition in hunting and gathering societies.
I got that bit. My thought was the following, in that here something seems to be in your argument, something seems to have shifted. That's how I understood your discussion on this slide. And my question is the thing that may have shifted perhaps the fact that rather than scarce energy or scarce mating opportunities in the modern human context, perhaps the most important scarce resource is social status. And that migration, therefore, also takes on a very different idea. You were talking about not biological children, but also cultural children. So if I'm migrating as a modern human, I may be doing this in social space. I don't know. I'm just making up the idea of social space, but
absolutely,
I don't know. As a sociologist, I would think that you probably have something to say about this.
Yes, absolutely, Jean-William. Max Weber also discussed this in other places. And what's valuable to humans is not just wealth and income. Wealth and income, status and power. Wealth and income, power, the ability to demand compliance, and status, the ability to demand or to receive imitation or copying or people following you. And yes, you could talk about shortage of all three. Now, do we compete more for status these days? Probably a lot. There's probably a lot of truth to that. Power, ability to demand compliance. It's funny, I see all these politicians running for office and I keep thinking, who would ever want that? But obviously some people do want power. Most academics probably more interested in the status, I guess. I don't know. We're not rich, but we're not poor either.
Probably true.
About the sex roles, I avoided getting into, you mentioned competition for mates, and I avoided getting into sexual selection. That's why I said males producing their potential offspring just take the sperm and eggs thing, because I have a whole paper, which is a whole theory of sexual selection, which is not connected to this at all. You might be interested in a quick summary of it, but
yeah, if there's time.
Sex is a matter of trade. Males by it, males include females if males and females are naturally selected to be somewhat different. That's the scary part of it for feminists like myself. They're naturally selected to be somewhat different. And that simplifies the trade, because some people would say sex is for variation. And then I can say, well, it doesn't have to be for variation. Specifically, it could be a specific kind of variation. That is, males include females as well as males among their offspring, and females include males as well as females among their offspring. And sex is trade. It reduces the risk of extinction, just like investing in index funds rather than trying to pick stocks, or dollar cost averaging rather than trying to time markets. And then sexual competition and selection is conflict over the profits of the trade. And you can get into the details about what each does and so on, but.
And are you saying sex is trade as in TRAIT, or are you saying sex is trade as in TRADE?
TRADE.
Yeah, okay. Then
trade.
Yeah.
They each include offspring that are like the other sex amongst their offspring. So but then they engage in conflict over the profits.
That's interesting. Yeah, Gary Becker might agree.
They engage in conflict over the profits.
Thank you.
Okay.
I will save my other question for later.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks both. Anybody else like to raise anything? Brian.
Yes, it's just a broad general question, Marion, regarding, because I'm interested in your work, not just this piece, but your work more broadly, and the sociological view of social-cultural evolution. What would be the, if I got you in an elevator and said, what would be the sort of political policy implications of your work? Your decades of great work behind you. What would be the main, political or social or policy implications of your work? Do you think, if I forced you to give me, 3 bullet points on it or something?
I don't think there are any. The culture evolves. There are implications for disciplines, like sociologists don't think biology is important, and biologists, some of them don't think social sciences are important, and that genes and culture co-evolve and interact is sort of obvious, I think. And in my article on gene culture coevolution games, I had a whole bunch of examples of what was known then of cases. But no, I think I'm a Max Weber. I don't think science is telling me anything about values. I've divided my life in two, like I did politics for half my life. I'm trying to do science for the other half.
Fair answer.
That may not be a very satisfactory answer to a lot of people.
No. It's just, when I hear you talk, I can, policy implications, seem to come to me. So, for instance, the point you just made to Jan Mullen about the sexes being different, which doesn't, of course, imply that they're inferiority or superiority. Just, but being different, has implications about how we, to use your terms, it might shed light on how we develop equal opportunity policies or social policies to support childcare and things like that.
Well, the interesting thing is that males and or their gametes are high frequency but low per capita costs, and females and or their gametes are low frequency but high per capita costs. And you have different forms of sexual competition. But the interesting thing is that the higher, if one happens to be better, have a higher frequency than the other, frequency times cost. Let's say the male's frequency time cost is higher than the female coming out of natural selection, lower than the female frequency times cost is lower than the male, then sexual competition is going to be more costly to males and more beneficial to females, and that balances the sex allocation. Or if you started the other way around, and you can show cases where it looks like it's one way or cases where it's the other way, but that balances the sex allocation. And that's incredibly revolutionary point, because of course Fisher thought that you balance the sex allocation by biasing the sex ratio of your offspring in favor of the underrepresented sex. And this is a much easier way of doing it. Sexual competition and selection will balance it because it's more beneficial to one, whichever one it is, and more costly to the other, whichever one it is. And that's incredibly revolutionary idea, going all the way back to a major point of Fisher's.
Okay, thank you. That was good.
Jan Mullen?
I said I would wait until other people would ask questions, but I was actually waiting for Jeff to come in on the replication point. So
yes, why not?
Well, but maybe you need a little
point.
push from me, and then we can have that discussion. So as you were intimating, Marion, that this is obviously something that has come up in previous meetings and seminars and discussions.
Yeah.
And I was very interested in what you were saying there, and but still wrapping my head around it. But I think I understood what you were saying, and I don't see any direct reason to disagree with that. I think what you were saying, it's replication of the complete life cycle. So you need both the sort of somatic and the reproductive parts, or the survival and the reproduction parts, and that whole thing is reproduced. We'll call that the life cycle. Would the implication of that be that then replication my first note here that I made as you were talking was, so then replication is just the same as reproduction.
No,
But I guess your whole point is no, it's both survival plus reproduction.
that's right.
So I was trying to understand what it solves to define replication in that way. In some sense, if it's both, if replication is the replication of the whole cycle of surviving and reproducing of an organism, that is what is, then in a way, replication just means repetition.
Yes, repetition. That's right. Except that's what I said in a previous paper once. I talked about, without using these game models, repetition of somatic functions, repetition of reproduction functions, and then repetition of the whole. Yes. And it's not, how can I say it? It's not necessary. It's that if we want to talk about replication beyond genes, we want to talk about organisms evolving, then we have to do it as life cycles. We have to say we're talking about life cycles. Life cycles repeat, but nothing other than genes do, perhaps, and certainly organisms don't.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, in my mind, if we go that route, then we end up just describing. Yeah, so we're describing what happens, which is that these life cycles, which consist of these two aspects, survival and reproduction, get repeated. They get repeated over time.
But
And
not just, because we have models here of under what conditions they can be. You know, if they're relating this way, they replicate that way. If they're relating this way, parasitic, then they replicate that way, and so on.
okay,
But models of the conditions under which, theories of the conditions under which they
okay. So
can
you
do replicate.
in management, we would call those contingency theories, the sort of contingency relations under which you would have certain. Okay, so
Yeah.
then the theorizing is on the contingencies under which you get these different life cycles, and that's maybe also where I still needed some clarification on the slide that you have up now about the models, because you were talking there about, that's the bit that I didn't fully get, and I think it's very fundamental to what you were trying to say. You seem to be talking about some sort of relationship which is either antagonistic or complementary between somatic and reproductive, but what functions, or
I call them
how
that.
am I to understand that part of your because it seems very important to what you were saying.
I called them that. I called them functions. Maybe I should think of a better term. I don't know. I haven't written this up yet, you know, I'm just working on
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
You know,
I've got
usually
a-
we
I've got-
can distinguish them.
I've
Usually
got
we
a
can
related
distinguish them
observation
structurally.
here. I think what when you talk about replication, Marion, I think you're talking about something very different from what I mean, or and perhaps some other people mean by replication. That doesn't make you wrong, right? Far from it, because replication is a sort of portmanteau word, and we can define it in different ways. But I think we're pointing to different things. You're by replication, you're pointing to copying of life cycles, things that look similar, being passed on, so on. I don't mean that by replication. By replication, I mean passing on key information, and that the information is key. It's not any information. It's key because it has some program-like quality to aid the birth of a new entity and its development under contingent circumstances and its further procreation.
I
So
understand that, but it's not true biologically. You know, if you hand on genes, that's all you hand on, and there's a million other things that you're not handing on and that are different and so on.
hang on a minute. I didn't say it has to be all to do with that.
Okay.
right? Well, we all know that any process of reproduction is contingent and involves external matter, stimuli, signals, all these things. The gene doesn't do everything, right? It's like a computer program. It doesn't do everything. The computer program depends on input, and it depends on circumstances, and it can be inert. It can be wiped off the computer memory bank. Nowhere is the commitment in my position involved that everything must be in the genes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that's not part of the stipulation. It's crucial information which programs under certain conditions with certain inputs the development of a particular entity.
Yeah. All I'm saying
And
about
I would suggest the genes do that.
all I'm saying about cells is that
Not cells, genes, genetic information,
yeah,
genomic information.
but when
It's not,
cells
not talking about
duplicate,
cells.
when cells duplicate, only
Yeah.
very, very little of it, what they end
Yeah.
up doing is from programmed information.
Okay.
Because there's so much other stuff there
Yeah.
besides
But
genes.
the DNA remains more or less the same.
Yeah.
And that's the crucial information. That's at the genetic level is the DNA. Right. And we all know the stories about other levels, multi-level selection, memes, culture, institutions, all the other stuff which talk about, which are complicated, routines, habits. Those are candidates which in some way might be able to form multi-levels. So for me, the development of Darwinian ideas in the social context is both recognizing the genetic legacy and discovering new replicators, possibly at multiple levels.
I understand that there are great detailed analogies between language and genes.
Yeah.
Great detailed analogies. I mean,
yeah, and also big differences. Yeah. So I'm if you were to write this up, I would suggest as a positive comment to be careful about distinguishing between different meanings for replication.
Okay.
And what you mean by it, contrasting to someone else.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's helpful. Thank you.
Because that would help the reader who might come from a different perspective, not just mine, but others, steer their way through what you're trying to get at conceptually, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. Any more? Well, we look forward to the paper, Marion. Any idea when you might
take my time over the rest of the summer at least?
Oh, well, that's not too long to wait. That'll be great. Anybody else? Yeah, Willem, you got your hand up still?
No, I put it back up because I would find it I would like to continue the discussion a little bit more because I think there's some stuff there at least that I'm still trying to understand and that I think is very interesting and it may be helpful for Marion to discuss it as well in thinking about how she wants to write it up. We were a few minutes ago also on this idea that you were talking about somatic and reproductive functions and how they relate to each other. And that seems to be very central to your table here. But could you give some concrete or specific examples of how these things may be either complementary or even, because you seem to be talking about them as possibly antagonistic and parasitic, and I didn't quite understand what I should make of that exactly, and maybe examples might help.
Yeah, there are lots of cases. I didn't get into a lot of empirical look at this case and look at that case, but there are a lot of cases where, say, offspring, the early phase of offspring production, and then some of them are absorbed back in, they don't keep going, keep developing into offspring. And in other cases where where some of them digest each other. Do you know what I mean? Where they're obviously engaging in conflict to some extent and so on. This all comes into developmental biology, you know, and it depends upon the taxa you're studying and so on and so forth. But there is a lot of stuff out there that I could point to. Oh, look at this case and look at that case and look at this case. And I don't know how much I'll do that. Sometimes I've done a lot of that and sometimes I've done very little of it. I'm not sure. I certainly haven't got it done, that's for sure. And whether I will or not, I'm not sure. I'll see.
And is then the idea of the third column that on top of the fact that these sort of how things work somatically in terms of survival versus how they work in terms of reproduction, and that apparently these can also be in conflict with each other, that in the third column there is yet another layer of complexity, which is the culture, which again can sort of complicate things.
Yeah, I didn't really relate it in
Is that sort of
detail
the
to the
idea?
others. Yeah. It's just that I already know I did these games in gene culture first a long time ago and didn't do them into the biological stuff here. Do you see what I mean? So we know, or at least we knew then, it's quite clear. It was quite clear then. There are lots of examples that genes and culture can compete, they can cooperate, genes can parasitize culture, culture can parasitize genes. And there's lots of examples known about that. But putting it into the high density, low density context, I did that then a bit. But again, that's something else I'm going to have to think about. They match well with the games, but how substantively, because of different reasons, because of the mode of transmission, you know, vertical, oblique, horizontal, and so on. I mean, think about how culture can parasitize genes when it's transmitted horizontally. I once taught a half-year course on sex and cults. And it's great to watch how culture parasitizes genes in those cases, a lot of cases. You know, they convince people to set aside their own family, and the real family is the sect and the cult, and the real daddy is the head of the sect, and the real children are the people that they recruit into the sect, and so on and so forth. It's completely, they're beautifully parasitic, and so on. So there are lots of these kinds of things that go on.
I could even argue that most of human culture is, you know, making use of these sorts of mismatches, evolutionary psychology mismatches.
Yeah. Well,
maybe a last question. When you talk about games, you're talking about game theoretical models, I suppose.
Yeah, this
Right.
cooperative.
I don't know the specific paper that you're referring to, but I guess you're talking about game theoretical models. And on your very first slide, you also, what you seem to promise is an integration of different ways of looking at evolution, going from what was it, ecology. So there's, what was it, ecology?
Yeah, the density dependence is the ecology.
Then it's ecology, and then you end up with gene culture coevolution. And you say, yeah, we need both the ecology and we need the games. At that moment, as you were saying that, I was, this was, I think, already at the very beginning on your very first slide, I was thinking, does that relate to this idea of multi-level selection at all? Are the games about conflicts within the group, and the ecology about how the individual or the group competes in the broader environment? So is there a link to multi-level selection? Logic
multi-level
there?
selection doesn't change anything. It's true for any level selection you're talking about, whether you're talking about genes or organisms or groups or whatever. You still need, if you say you're talking about eusocial colonies even, you need the ecological and you need the social and you need it together. So I think I often, to myself anyway, use the word originals, from any originals, because whenever you start something, when you start analyzing something like this, there has to be something there to start. So did we have, say, many small or few large or whatever? And whether that's organisms or eusocial colonies or whatever, Okay, you have something there to start, those originals, and we go from there. But those originals can be at any of these levels of selection. If it is a true level of selection, you accept it as such, like social colonies are for most people, but probably most groups aren't. But that's another argument, another discussion.
Thank you.
Great. Marion, can I ask you as a kind of semi-academic, semi-personal question?
Sure.
How is it? Do you get an audience? Does any sociologists listen to this kind of argument?
Well, my favorite society is the International Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology. And I've been there every year since 1990. Every 2 years we meet since 1999. And they held it, believe it or not, in Toronto this year, which quite miraculous. Never been here before.
Right.
So I always go there. Sociologists, well, we have a section in the American
okay.
Sociological Association.
Yeah.
But they're more, believe it or not, you'd be shocked. The more of them are biological reductionists than anything else. They're studying.
I know there's a book by Prieto and who's the other guy?
Yeah, they do.
Which is completely
biochemical stuff.
reductionist.
They do biochemical stuff and stuff like not
Yeah,
all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah.
And then they switched lately to get rid of their newsletters and just send these little one-item things out, and they're hopeless. So I've kind of lost touch with them, to tell you the truth. But they're going to start
Yeah.
again in September. I was chair of it once upon a time for a year or two. No, there aren't a lot, but at least at ISH, and their social scientists are fewer there than anything else. But it is great because biologists actually come and talk to biologists, philosophers, historians, and social scientists actually talk to each other about biology and often about evolution in general. So it's great in that sense. And there's probably fewer social scientists than anything else, but still.
Yeah. But in terms of getting evolutionary or Darwinian ideas across, sociology seems to be the most hopeless currently. I mean,
I think that's probably true.
Yeah,
the best thing is to take a look at the Cultural Evolution Society, and I've been kind of lax. I haven't been going there. I went to the States once just to see what was going on, and I went online just to see what was going on once. But it's going to be in England I think this coming fall. Soon. I forget where. I can. I'll email it to you. But it is going to be in England.
Thank you.
Probably worth checking out.
Yeah, well, if you could send it to the members, that'd be good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's useful information to know how these networks are working.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much
Well,
for your
thank you
talk,
very much
Marion. I mean,
for all your work, Jeff.
Really look forward to this paper. It is quite different what you're doing, and I hopefully will cast light on many new things. But thanks ever so much for a stimulating talk, and thanks for everyone for coming.